Secretary Byrd, very simply, is it possible for non-citizens to illegally vote in federal elections?
It is.
And do you have examples of this occurring?
We do. I mentioned 2 individuals in Florida who've been recently arrested and charged with illegally attempting to vote in Florida elections.
And both of those situations occurred after Congress made it illegal for non-citizens to vote, correct?
That is correct.
Do you think Congress should consider legislation such as the SAVE Act to close the gaps which allow non-citizens voting?
It's absolutely critical.
Okay. Is amending the NVRA an important first step?
The NVRA must be amended.
And can states, when administering services such as social and medical benefits, impact either intentionally or unintentionally the federal prohibition on non-citizens voting?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Mitchell, I want to ask you about President Biden's Executive Order 14019 on promoting access to voting. Can you speak to some of the concerns with this executive order?
Absolutely. First of all, I believe that it's unconstitutional. But having said that, why is it that the Biden administration has absolutely resisted every effort to turn over any of the plans by any of the agencies? The House Committee on Administration issued subpoenas in July to every cabinet secretary and have been asking for the plans for implementing Executive Order 14019. And not a single agency plan has been turned over to the House Administration Committee. And I included in my written testimony a file from a whistleblower who sent to me. He is a U.S. Marshal, and he sent the Department of Justice guidelines, instructions to all the U.S. Marshals, requiring them, notifying them that they're required to offer voter registration materials and voter education materials to everyone with whom they come into contact, including, and he sent me a file of someone who had to be registered to vote, who was a prisoner in a Texas federal facility. He's in prison for violating federal law because he was deported and returned. He's a Mexican citizen. It says that in his file. And he was registered to vote, and they are required to give him voter registration materials. That is happening in federal prisons all over the country.
So let me ask you, then, is it your understanding that they are actually implementing the very plans that they refuse to turn over to Congress?
They're absolutely doing that, and we only know, we get bits and snatches from people, from whistleblowers and from various sources, but nothing official. And if you want to know the most, you go to the Demos website, which is a left-wing organization, and they have literally been dispatched by the White House to federal agencies to help them implement this plan. They know more about what's going on in these agencies to implement this executive order than any member of Congress.
Are they involved with implementing the executive order?
Yes, they are.
And are they in compliance with FACA or the Federal Advisory Committee Act?
No, they are not. No, they
so they're violating FACA.
They are violating that. Yes, they are. And they brag about all the agencies that they have assisted over the last 3 years with implementing the executive order.
This executive order obviously involves these various federal agencies in the voting process. Besides the concern that these agencies do not have expertise in this area, should the American people be concerned that this will be administered by politically appointed officials of the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, absolutely, because the original executive order required that every plan had to be submitted to the White House, to the director of the Office of Domestic Policy, which at the time was held by Susan Rice. And it also goes on to say that federal funds and grants will be disseminated through the White House by the Office of Domestic Policy, by Susan Rice.
Hey, so Vernon say this shit got the ballers written all over it. Man, I don't know about that. The ballers pulled some shit, but fucking with Dre? Damn, it's the only lead we got, though. So go get with Vernon and see what's what. Sniff it out, man. I think you'll make the right call.
And they're being implemented as we speak.
They are being implemented.
We as Congress have not been able to get our hands on a document.
Not a single document.
I guess I have a question. Why would they want to hide this information?
That's a good question.
I think it's only she and Susan.
They tell you how much is being played. These people should be in jail, man. Them playing with these fucking people. Put their ass straight in jail. That's what it's on. voting or doing nothing dealing with the election, dealing with Congress.
Hey, let's roll. Let's drive, right? Here's where we headed. So did Franklin tell you we going after the ballers today? Everyone I asked, one name kept coming up for these Drake tracks. Dude called P. A real baller OG. Go back as far as I do with DNF. We're gonna need to talk to him. A lot. And that'll probably mean killing a whole bunch of his dudes. Nothing you can't handle, right? I got some boys meeting us over there.
Despite the looming danger, African nations are taking action. Burkina Faso is even developing drones to fight back. But is this fight being waged without Western intervention? And can Africa do it alone? Let's find out. The insurgency in Africa, and it is done without Western aid. But what's the current condition in Africa? When we talk about insurgency in Africa today, we aren't dealing with isolated incidents or fringe groups causing minor unrest. What we're witnessing is the evolution of insurgent networks into highly organized, dangerous forces that not only destabilize regions, but are now interwoven with global terrorism. Insurgency on the continent has deep roots, particularly in areas like the Sahel, a vast stretch of land that runs across West and Central Africa, where insurgent groups have found sanctuary amidst weak governance, porous borders, and underdeveloped infrastructure. A large part of the problem can be traced back to the historical and geographical realities of Africa. The borders we know today were drawn up by European colonial powers in the late 19th century without any consideration for the ethnic, cultural, or religious groups that populated the continent.
Shit, I knew things were going to get
resulted
heavy.
in nations
Hold
that
them
were
down.
fractured from the start, filled
Oh,
with
you're going to war with the
internal
feds.
divisions that have changed over time. Nigeria, for example, is one of Africa's most powerful countries, yet its northern region remains the hotbed of crime. The northern half of Nigeria, predominantly Muslim and economically neglected, has long been fertile ground for insurgent ideology to take root. What's different about insurgency in Africa compared to other parts of the world, like the Middle East or Southeast Asia, is how these groups have adapted to the continent's unique socio-political environment. The Sahel, with its unforgiving climate, vast, sparsely populated stretches, offers perfect conditions for insurgent groups to hide, weaken, and move across borders with little interference. Governments often have limited presence in these remote areas, leaving the door wide open for insurgent groups to operate freely. The economic backdrop of the Sahel cannot be ignored either. This is one of the poorest regions in the world, where poverty, unemployment, and lack of education create a sense of hopelessness for millions of young people. Insurgent groups in Mali tap into these grievances by offering the first form of salvation. For many young men, joining an insurgent group is not driven by religious fervor, but by the promise of freedom and a sense of purpose. In this sense, insurgency in Africa isn't just a security issue, it's an economic one. But here's where things get even more complicated. The role of foreign powers. France, for example, has had a military presence in the Sahel for years under its operation.
Before I discovered Walden University,
Check it out.
Which aims to curb the spread of jihadist groups in the region. While the French government intended to stabilize the region, the presence of foreign troops often stirred resentment among local populations. Instead of viewing foreign intervention as a stabilizing force, many Africans see it as a continuation of colonial control. Insurgent groups have been quick to exploit this sentiment, positioning themselves as defenders of African sovereignty against Western imperialism. It's a powerful narrative that has resonated with many disillusioned communities.
Don't ask
What's
stupid
worse,
than you is.
Western military
talking about
interventions
Drake,
have often
the phone.
failed to address the underlying
Yeah, we
causes
heard
of
about that
insurgency, poverty,
Y'all
corruption,
think we
and
got
the disenfranchisement of
Murder.
certain groups.
Dog, look
Instead,
at me.
They focused on
That ain't got
military
nothing to do with
solutions,
us.
which may
We got nothing
temporarily
but respect
suppress
for the homie
insurgent
Drake.
groups, but do
Give
little
me
to
something,
change the
P.
conditions
Fast.
that allowed those groups to rise in the
Look,
first place.
I heard there's
This is
something
a key
going on
reason
over in
why
the
insurgent
projects.
movements continue to
Vagos
gain
running their
strength
mouth about
despite
Drake playing
years of
some
foreign
joints no one's
intervention.
heard.
In the face of this
Self-snitching
growing crisis,
motherfuckers.
African nations
That's what
are
I know.
increasingly questioning whether
You better
Western
hope you're right.
involvement is helping, or if
Okay,
it's
y'all, we're
time for the
done here.
continent to take
I'll
matters
be in touch
into
with
its own
Franklin when we
hands.
good to move.
Countries like Mali and Burkina Faso have already made moves to reduce their reliance on foreign powers, seeking homegrown solutions to combat insurgency. But the road ahead is long and difficult. Can African unity end insurgency in the continent? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity.
Hey, what's up?
Continue now. The concept of African unity is a powerful.
Sure thing.
Evokes
Limo en route.
Pan-Africanism, solidarity, and collective strength. It's an idea that has existed since the days of liberation movements, as African nations sought to throw off the shackles of colonialism and chart their path. But when it comes to insurgency, can unity be the answer? Can African nations, so diverse and often divided by borders and internal conflicts, truly come together to tackle one of the continent's greatest threats? First, it's important to understand what we mean by unity. In the context of combating insurgency, unity isn't just about political solidarity or military alliances. It's about a shared vision for the future, where African nations cooperate not just out of necessity, but because they believe in a common cause. This type of unity would require African countries to not only pool their resources, but also align their strategies, share intelligence, and create a framework for collective security. It's a tall order, especially when you consider the fractured state of many African nations today. Take, for instance, the ongoing conflict in the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, all plagued by insurgent violence, have formed the Alliance of Sahel States AES as a way to combat these threats collectively. This is a promising development, signaling that African nations are beginning to take ownership of their security issues, rather than relying solely on foreign powers. The AES aims to create a coordinated military response to insurgent groups, with the hope that a unified front will be more effective than fragmented national efforts. However, unity on the continent faces several obstacles. For one, the borders created by colonial powers have left many African nations with deep internal divisions. These borders often cut across ethnic and tribal lines, creating nations where unity is difficult to achieve even at a national level. Nigeria, for example, is home to more than 250 ethnic groups, many of which have long-standing grievances against the central government. In such a context, achieving continental unity seems like an impossible task. But the challenges don't stop at internal divisions. African unity must also contend with the legacy of foreign interference. For decades, African nations have relied on foreign military aid and intervention to address their security issues, particularly from Western countries like France and the United States. This is where the potential for African unity becomes both a challenge and an opportunity. If African nations can band together, not just militarily, but also politically and economically, they may be able to break free from the cycle of dependency on foreign powers. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area AFCFTA, which aims to create a single market for goods and services across Africa, are a step in the right direction. By boosting intra-African trade and economic cooperation, the continent could reduce its reliance on foreign aid and create the kind of economic growth that addresses some of the root causes of insurgency: poverty, unemployment, and inequality. But economic cooperation alone won't be enough. African unity must also focus on improving governance and addressing the socio-political factors that drive insurgency. In many parts of Africa, weak institutions, corruption, and lack of accountability have created a vacuum that insurgent groups are more than happy to fill. If African nations are serious about ending the insurgency, they will need to invest in building strong, transparent institutions that can provide the services and security that their citizens need. Ultimately, the question of whether African unity can end insurgency comes down to whether the continent's leaders are willing to make the difficult choices necessary for real change. Unity won't come easily, and it won't come quickly. But if African nations can find a way to put aside their differences, work together, and take ownership of their future, they might just be